State Superintendent Thurman is an educator, social worker, and public school parent who has served the people of California for more than 10 years in elected office. Previously, Superintendent Thurman served on the Richmond City Council, West Contra Costa Unified School Board, and the California State Assembly, representing District 15. In the State Assembly, Superintendent Thurman served on the Assembly Education Committee, Health, Human Services Committees, and he chaired the Assembly Labor Committee and the Assembly Select Committee on Science, Technology, Engineering, and Math, STEM. Education is at the core of Superintendent Thurman's legislative record. Superintendent Thurman lives in Richmond and has 2 daughters who attend local public schools. They are his inspiration and a constant reminder about the promise of our neighborhood schools and the strong future that every child deserves. So that's the written down part, and that's all very true. And what I have the pleasure of doing is introducing someone who I also have the pleasure of calling a friend, and I think a lot of you in this room also have that experience, and that speaks volumes about our superintendent, that we can look to him as our state educational leader and also call him a friend to education. Some of the things I'd like to highlight that he has accomplished already in his short tenure. We talked a little bit about the charter task force that was convened. That was, he may tell you a little bit more about, nope, nothing more about that, but potentially, maybe later. He could tell you a little bit about how, and also Superintendent Sala could tell you that that was a huge commitment for the group that was assembled around that table in a very tight timeline, being able to come out with some specific and weighty recommendations that are even in real time informing the field now. His statewide literacy campaign. So there's a statewide literacy campaign that's been launched with a pilot in Riverside and Tulare counties that is impacting thousands of students as we speak. And he may tell you a little bit more about that, but things like giving $500,000 to provide books and after-school programs. And I think we are increasingly aware of after-school programs to actually do multiple things. Obviously serve our students and provide an enhancement to the between the bells instruction they're getting, but also as a critical resource for our future professionals in the teacher workforce. And Superintendent Thurman has also done a lot of convening and is now developing policies around diversifying the teacher pipeline, working with Linda Darlingham and others. So I'm going to stop there. I have about 5 more things, but you're going to have to tell folks what they are. And I very much appreciate you being here and traversing the freeways of the Bay Area to ensure that we hear your voice. Superintendent Thurman.
Good morning, everyone. I was very nervous. When Superintendent Monroe said she's going to tell you some stuff, I'm like, okay. Let me just look down for a while. And she's been a great friend and partner. We both started in this area in political life at about the same time. And at the time, I was running for the Assembly, and she was running for her first term as county superintendent. And she was one of the first people that I called when I had this idea, I called it, that I was going to run for county superintendent, state superintendent. And she said, "Are you sure you want to do that?" And that's what everyone said to me. They said, "Are you sure you want to do that?" They said, "Why would you give up a safe seat in the legislature to take on this new job?" And I told people that I had reflected on my time in the Assembly. Nearly every bill that I introduced, or what I really put my energy behind, was about helping young people. And so it struck me that a job where I could be focused all the time on helping young people was the job for me in politics. And to a person, everyone said, Jack O'Connell said, "I'll support you if you get your head checked first." He literally said that. Seek consultation. If you still want to do this, I'll support you. And hearing that from him and from others who said that this is a job that has no ability to get things done, really was a lot to contend with. And then my colleagues in the legislature would say, you have 12 more years that you can serve. You've been elected with the highest percentage of any legislator in the state's history. You're risking everything. And I told them, our kids are risking so much all the time, and so now I'm risking something too. And I share that with you to let you know how our experience with the task force started. Literally, we met for 3 months every Thursday for 4 to 6 hours in ways that were very difficult, talking about difficult subjects. But we started every single meeting with the frame and the perspective of what it was that we loved about California students. It was important to me that these conversations that were going to be tough, be focused, and viewed through the lens of what is best for students. And so it is that way that we approached the Charter Task Force to come up with some reform ideas in the areas that had not been reformed in significant ways since the initial legislation was passed. And so for us, that was our task, to really have these conversations through the context and the lens of what is best for students. We had tough conversations, did we not? Superintendent Manansala, thank you for giving us every Thursday from 9 to 5 on almost a single issue. And being in the room with peers and partners and friends, but many of whom could not agree on much. But everyone agreed that we had to find a way to do what was best for kids. I don't know why the governor asked me to chair this task force. I wanted to run from it. Many of you know that the experience I had, even just getting to this position, got defined by charter versus non-charter issues. And I thought that that was a misrepresentation of what the real issues were in the state of California. I wanted to talk about how we closed the achievement gap. I wanted to talk about the lack of funding for our schools. I wanted to talk about the rising cost of education for our school districts, because I came from a local school district. And when decisions were passed down from the state, it felt to me like, okay, I'm gonna go work in the state level to try and make more resources available for our schools. And so I really felt that the charter versus non-charter was it really was a false issue for how we should talk about education. I think when you really get to the bottom of it, what we're really seeing is that charter growth happened for a reason. But it happened at a time, right? Parents and others are saying they wanted something else. But it happened at a time when most of our schools in this state were experiencing declining enrollment, dwindling resources. And if you really look deeply, to me, where our challenges start, they really do start with how we fund education in this state. It is not a mystery that prior to the passage of Prop 13, California was #1 of all states in per pupil spending. And immediately after the passage of Prop 13, we see how California plummets in where it stands in per pupil spending. And at the same time, we see, I think it's completely correlated, that California falls in where we stand in reading, third grade math, other kind of important benchmarks for our students. So from my perspective, the conversation about charter growth in this state has been about converging experiences. Schools experiencing dwindling funding, declining enrollment, challenges around the cost of special education, challenges around recruiting and retaining teachers, challenges for students, more of our students living in poverty who are impacted by homelessness and foster youth and abuse and trauma. And parents saying, hey, I want more, and advocates saying, I want more. And at the same time, new schools being created, but being created in a way that essentially says you have to compete for the same public dollar. Meaning new schools got created, but there was no mechanism that would say there'd be new funds for these new schools. So essentially what you have is a competition for the same public dollar. And I believe that all of these things ultimately leads to this this sort of narrative that we hear, charter versus non-charter. One of the interesting things in our task force, the task force brought a recommendation forward that when a new charter school would open, that there would be a hold harmless fund to hold the district that would lose students to that charter harmless on ADA for 1 year. Unfortunately, that did not make it into AB 1505. Because I think a lot of what we're talking about is about resources. And look at I don't know how it is on the campuses in your districts, but nearly every place that I've visited or any person I've spoken to has said, we don't have any more space for any new schools to open. In some cases, districts are sharing spaces with charter schools, sharing down to the classroom. Some of the biggest fights now are about facilities. And I don't know anyone who has any extra space for facilities of any kind. If you do, by the way, I'd like to encourage you to use it for the proposal we just got passed with the legislature and the governor this year to use surplus property for building teacher housing. And that would be open to all school districts and charters, that you could take surplus property and that there'd be planning money for you to build and design what your affordable housing might look like for teachers and certificated staff, by the way, classified staff, and that there would be tax credits that you can use to finance the cost of that housing. Obviously, we know that we need to do things to recruit and retain teachers, look at salaries, we need to look at the working conditions, but if you're in the Bay Area or other places in the state, one of the biggest challenges we face to retaining teachers is the high cost of housing. My kids go to school a little more than 40 minutes from here. We lose 200 teachers in our school district every year. The number one reason given is they cannot afford to live where they work. It's why I spent the last 4 years trying to get a teacher housing bill passed. I'm grateful that the governor saw to it that this would be a priority and that he put money in the budget for workforce housing tax credits, that school districts can partner with a nonprofit developer to build affordable housing for your workforce. Obviously, we have more to do, but it is another resource that we want to make available to you. I know that it's not the main topic of today. I wish it was, but to me it relates to the message that it is the resources issue and the competition of resources that has led to the challenges that we've experienced around charter growth and the charter versus non-charter discussion. From the time that we started this task force, we knew right away that there would be issues that people would not be able to reach agreement on. And so before there was ever a meeting, we made a decision that we would create a framework for how to reach decisions if we could not reach full consensus. And so we borrowed from the Supreme Court's framework of decision making, that if we couldn't reach consensus, that there would be a majority decision and a minority decision, and that we would tell the story of what happened no matter how it went down. It was very difficult. The media was hot on our trail and wanted to be in the room with all of the advocates working together. Now you can imagine what happens the moment you mention the media. Anyone in the media here today? I'm sure someone's tweeting or texting. My point is how do you have difficult conversations when people are looking over their shoulder about how the reporter might characterize that? And so we had to maintain this dance with the media and respect for any requests for public requests and any information. And we maintained a very tricky balance with the media. And what I committed to was holding a media briefing every other week so that we could give updates about what had taken place. We reached an agreement as a ground rule that we would agree what would be reported out of each meeting. We wanted to protect the privacy of the conversation so that people would be honest and sincere, but also respect that there was interest in public participation. And so we walked a very fine line there. And thankfully, we were able to manage it. But in a perfect world, we'd have a ground rule that said all participants of the task force would stay out of the advocacy for the bills that were in the legislature. I actually asked every member of our staff at the Department of Education to stay out of the Capitol on any day when any bill was being heard that dealt with charter reform. don't you know, even though I gave that, edict to all of our staff, and I held myself to that same standard, don't you know that the first time that AB 1505 was heard on the assembly floor, somebody tweeted out, "I just saw Tony Thurmond whipping votes to get that bill passed." I wasn't even in Sacramento. I also served as a trustee at CSU for the CSU system. And I was in Long Beach that day, the day that it was heard in Sacramento. That shows you the intensity of people's feelings about these issues. And so I suggested to our group that we have a ground rule, that no one on the task force be involved in the advocacy of these bills. People who were there were very honest, and they said, look, we represent stakeholders and coalitions, and we need to be able to be directly involved in the advocacy. And so our task force had members from California Teachers Association and the California Charter School Association together in the room doing really hard work on Thursdays. And then on Monday, when a bill was being heard, they were lobbying members for their different perspectives on how those bills should be played out. And so I just share that with you to give you a sense of how difficult the task was in front of us. We decided to start with some level setting, meaning everybody has a different perspective of what a charter is or what the charter debate should be about. We decided to start from a level setting where we brought in experts who had a historical perspective since 1992 when the initial enabling legislation was passed. We brought in the LAO's office. We brought in folks from FICMAT. What we quickly discovered is that even if someone was an expert, there was a disagreement on that expertise. And you would think, right, I believe in data. You would think if the data is clear, no one would agree on on the same set of data. And so we had to bring in two sets of experts. We had to bring in experts who articulated a stronger position on charter growth, and we had to bring in experts who talked about the fiscal impact that charters schools had on traditional public schools. And so as you can imagine, our conversations were always rife with tension. And while people held it together and they were professional, there was always just an element of why do this task force at all? Why have a conversation about fiscal impact? That was really the thing that drove the line, I think, between the growth advocates and those who wanted reform around growth. And those who felt that growth should not be challenged felt that, yes, there's a fiscal impact, but you should look at the fiscal impact, or you should look at the impact on kids not getting this or that. And so we wrestled with all these issues. At the end of the day, the decision was made to put forward every conversation and every vote that the task force took. And that in itself became controversial. The membership was controversial. People, I had to get off of social media. I haven't been on social media since this task force started because people accused me of loading up the task force with pro-charter advocates. And I said, didn't they just see what happened in my election and $40 million from the charter community was spent against me? Meaning, no matter how you put the people together, someone felt that some advantage took place or some disadvantage would take place. And so it seemed imperative to me that the only way we were going to make it was to tell the story of what happened in that room exactly as the conversations went down, exactly as the votes went down. And the final report got written just that way, exactly what took place. The folks who wanted to curb growth wanted the law to say that a local district may approve a charter as opposed to saying shall approve a charter. There was this whole shall to may. Everybody's got to have shall to may. I'm like, what is shall to may? And there was a vote to recommend that there would be a provision that would change the word shall to may. And that vote did not have success, and it fell short by a vote or two of the members. But at the same time, there were votes to say things like there should be a moratorium on virtual charter schools, and that vote prevailed. And so we made the decision to tell the story exactly as it went down, that there should be candor and just be straightforward. And that made everybody uncomfortable. That made everyone uncomfortable. Many say that if in the legislation no one's happy, they say then the public was served well, right? That was not a goal for me. That's never the goal for me. Our goal was always to aspire towards consensus. But if we couldn't reach consensus, we would identify if there was a majority. We would also offer the perspective of the minority position, but we would, with candor, bring forward what came out of the conversation. And so that's what we provided in our framework that talked about how to change renewal, right? Why are we still using API as the renewal guideline for a charter school? We don't use API in the state anymore. And so we made recommendations. Ultimately, that made its way into the final legislation, that we would be using the dashboard as a way of supporting renewal. There were debates about how renewal should happen in the task force, and those debates carried over into the work of AB 1505. I think there was a consensus that the State Board of Education should not be approving charter schools and authorizing charter schools. We believe in local control. We also believe that how can a state entity authorize something that is so far away across the state and just limited resources? Lisa will tell you, and she and her team have done an incredible job at the department of managing some 32 charter schools that had been approved by the state board with a team of 3 people. And so, I know that you all know that's not an effective way to provide oversight. And so the recommendations of the task force really looked at ways to provide better oversight and better authorizing. And we spent a lot of time talking about better authorizing. And from my standpoint, that's where the heart of the work is. If we can get to a place where there is clarity about what authorizing should be about. If your application contains these elements, you should be able to expect that you will be approved. And I really think that the heart of the matter is around what good authorizing is. I think there will continue to be discussion about what that looks like. I think the way the bill is played out, there will be discussion about how decisions will be made now that the state has a limited role in renewals, and that those will go back to the county. I think there'll be lots of questions about how this gets implemented. And we invite you all to be in conversation with us about how these new guidelines get implemented. Share your perspectives with us. Share your concerns. Help us think through the challenges that need to be considered in the places where the legislation has clear language, but may not be clear. Sometimes it's just not clear until you actually have to go implement it. And we know that our local districts are the ones that have to implement and live with these things. Grateful that the conversation included consideration of fiscal impact and community impact. From my standpoint, if there's going to be more growth in this state of charter schools, I would hope that that growth would be focused on places where we see need, meaning avoiding any duplication. That was the term that got used in our task force was saturation. There was an attempt by the members of the task force to reach an agreement on what saturation meant. The consideration was, could a district be able to say, look, we already have a number of charter schools and traditional public schools that are meeting this need. But if your charter school is going to be offering something that is not currently being provided, that would give greater consideration. That didn't exactly play out the way the folks were hoping, but the theme, that was a theme, an aspiration, how we might approach it. And to me, it seems like that is an opportunity for us to think about how growth might happen, since we are currently still finding ourselves competing for the same public dollar for new schools. I think we should be thoughtful about where growth should happen. So, I'll leave you with this and then be happy to take your questions. That we need your input, your questions, your concerns on how we shape the implementation of what was passed in AB 1505. We like for you all to be our partners and to share your experiences proactively so that we can get ahead of it, so that we can change the debate and change the narrative on how we support students in public education, period, in the state of California. I'll also share with you that we are looking for someone who wants to take over the helm of our charter school division at the state of California. I'm a shameless advocate. I'll just put that out there. We have had the benefit of Lisa Constancio's incredible leadership of our charter division at the California Department of Education. She's been tapped to help in some other areas where we want to help school districts. And so we're looking for someone who is interested in helping us to continue the conversation and to steward the conversation. And then finally, I would just leave you with this. No matter what gets written in legislation, no matter what guidelines the state board passes, or even CDE, whatever guidelines and regulations we create, our work has to be guided by what is best for helping young people. Because we've got a lot of young people in this state whose experience was just like mine. Before you is the descendant of African slaves and immigrants from Panama and Jamaica and Detroit, Michigan, by way of Mississippi. And I'm someone who grew up on the free lunch program, ashamed to admit it, shamed by my peers, kids who made fun of me for eating the free lunch program. I carried an orange ticket that said, free lunch student right here, got teased for eating it. I tried to eat the lunch underneath my desk every day. I became an adult and I realized everyone in my school was on the free lunch program. I was on the food stamps program. You know I'm gonna say it, my kids make fun of me, but I tell them I ate so much government cheese I thought that USDA was a brand name. These are programs that help my family to overcome poverty, but the most important public program to help my family was getting a great public education. And that's where we need to be focused, whether it's charter reform or how we do a better job of funding special education, our work to close the achievement gap, to prepare our students for the jobs of tomorrow, and ultimately to improve our per pupil spending. My commitment to you is that my top 2 priorities in office, for as long as you allow me to be in it, will be to help you and help us close the achievement gap. This afternoon, we're hosting a virtual town hall. We've invited all 1,000 school districts in the state to participate. And we're not asking you to show off your best practices. If you have them, we welcome that. We're asking the question, how can we be helpful to you? How can we help you in closing the gap? Because in spite of everyone's great efforts, we know that the gap persists. And we've got to be serious about closing it. And so all that to say that I'm prioritizing how we do our work together to close the gap and how we increase the funding for our students. Because even with local control funding formula, we continue to be 41st in the nation in per pupil spending. They say that you show your value by what you put in your budget. I think our kids are number 1. And I'm going to be fighting with you to make sure that we fund our schools like they're number 1 in the state of California. Thank you for hearing me today, and thank you for the great work that you do. Thank you very much.